Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's just a little more complicated than swiping right on a dating app. Imagine you're in a small medieval village. The air smells of fresh bread. The clatter of carts fills the streets, and you catch the occasional flicker of candlelight through small windows. Romance, however, is a far cry from the Instagram perfect moments we dream about today. Medieval dating was, let's just say, you probably wouldn't survive it without a good dose of patience and some serious social savvy. No texting, subtites, no sneaky DMs, and absolutely no romantic comedies to guide you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, go ahead and drop your location and local time. Makes this whole bedtime thing feel like we're sharing in this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, what was dating really like in medieval times? Well, let's just say it wasn't the get-to-know-you kind of deal you might expect. In fact, it was more of a family affair than a personal one. And there were no Netflix and chill moments. Relationships were often viewed through a lens of social necessity rather than personal choice. Your feelings, well, those were often secondary to your family's desires, your social standing, and even your economic prospects. Forget about going out to dinner or meeting someone at a bar. Medieval courtship was often formal, heavily structured, and governed by societal rules that would make today's rules of engagement look like child's play. The concept of love, especially the kind we imagine today, full of romantic gestures and heart-fluttering moments, wasn't quite the focus. Instead, relationships were about partnerships, alliances, and securing one's place in the social hierarchy. But don't think for a second that there wasn't room for real love. Well, sometimes. Just not in the way we see it now. So as we take this journey into the past, let's see what medieval dating really looked like. Spoiler alert, it's not as dreamy as you might think. Now, before you start thinking medieval courtship was just a series of awkward glances across a room, let's break down one of the most important elements of the medieval dating scene: parental approval. If you were looking for love back then, it wasn't just about what you felt in your heart. No. You could be madly in love with someone, but if your parents didn't approve, well, it wasn't happening. Marriage wasn't just an individual choice. It was a family matter. And the family's reputation and alliances were at stake. In fact, for most people, parental consent was a necessary prerequisite to even thinking about getting married. In a world without online dating or self-help books, your parents' decision carried serious weight. Picture this. You're a young noblewoman, and you've just met someone who sets your heart racing. You're thinking about how life could be, just the two of you, walking through the fields hand in hand. But then your father, the lord of the manor, steps in with a completely different agenda. He's not thinking about your happiness. He's thinking about family alliances, wealth, and securing your place in the social structure. You can see where this is going. The decision to marry wasn't just a romantic choice, but a strategic one. And your personal feelings, well, they could be easily swept aside if the match didn't meet your family's standards. Historians still argue about how much actual love was involved in medieval marriages. Some suggest that love was less of a consideration and more of a pleasant bonus, while others believe that it was still possible for couples to develop affection and even deep love over time, despite the social constraints. Regardless, the need for parental approval was non-negotiable. And if your family didn't approve of your chosen partner, that was a problem that likely wouldn't go away without serious persuasion. And sometimes, not even then. Let's add a little more complexity to this. Not all relationships were about building alliances or securing wealth. For the common people, love and marriage were often more about survival and practicality. When you were a peasant, living from harvest to harvest, you didn't have time to think about grand romantic gestures. You needed someone to help with the farm work and raise children. In this scenario, love might be considered secondary to finding a partner who could help make life a little easier, even if you didn't feel butterflies in your stomach when you looked at them. Marriage meant shared responsibility, and that was often enough. So, you see, courtship in the medieval period wasn't exactly about spontaneous romance or matchmaking through shared interests. It was more about duty, family dynamics, and, occasionally, the hope that love would grow out of those practical arrangements. Let's dig a little deeper into one of the most significant aspects of medieval relationships: marriage. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Because in the medieval world, marriage wasn't just about love. No. It was more like a business transaction than a romantic partnership. And when it came to courtship and marriage, alliances were the key factor. You weren't just marrying your partner, you were marrying into their family, their wealth, and their social status. Forget about running off into the sunset with your one true love. In medieval times, your marriage was often determined by what would benefit your family the most. Picture this. You're a young noblewoman, and your family is looking to strengthen its influence and wealth. You've spent your life learning how to make polite conversation, play the harp, and host grand feasts. But none of that matters unless you can secure a marriage that brings with it land, power, or titles. Your family will select a match based on these factors, and your romantic feelings are, unfortunately, irrelevant. The idea of marrying for love wasn't completely absent, but it was more of a rare exception than the rule. For most, marriage was about securing a better future, not just for yourself, but for your family and your lineage. Historians still debate whether medieval people had any concept of love matches when it came to marriage. Some believe that the idea of marrying for love was slowly emerging during the late Middle Ages, particularly with the rise of courtly love and more individualistic views of relationships. However, the practical side of marriage, securing land, forming political alliances, and maintaining social status, remained dominant for much of the medieval period. That meant that for many, especially in the upper classes, choosing a partner wasn't about chemistry, it was about what kind of leverage you could gain through the union. Now, let's talk about the social dynamics that played into this. In a medieval marriage, the bride was often seen as a form of currency, her dowry, a collection of land, money, or goods that her family would offer to the groom, was considered one of the most important parts of the transaction. The size of the dowry could significantly impact the value of the marriage, especially for noble families. If your dowry was substantial, it made you a desirable match. But if your family couldn't afford to offer much, well, your marriage prospects would look different. This wasn't just the case for noble marriages, though. Even among the peasantry, marriages were still driven by necessity. Land, livestock, and the ability to help on the farm were just as important as personal affection. You needed someone who could work alongside you, raise children to help with the labor, and ensure that your family would continue to survive through harsh winters. In this context, love might grow, but it wasn't the driving force behind the union. A quirky tidbit here. In some regions of medieval Europe, a special type of marriage contract existed called the marriage by conquest. This would occur when a knight, typically after a successful military campaign, would claim a woman as his prize, and a marriage would be arranged shortly thereafter. While this was more of an exception than the rule, it's fascinating to think that marriage could, in some circumstances, be seen as a reward or an extension of military glory rather than a personal choice. So, while today, most people can choose a spouse based on love, attraction, and shared interests, medieval marriages were more likely to be about securing a position in society, forming alliances, and providing stability for future generations. In a world where survival often depended on the strength of your family's network, love wasn't always the first thing on the menu when it came to matchmaking. Let's talk about arranged marriages and how they were central to medieval society. In the medieval period, who you married was often determined long before you were old enough to understand the romantic implications. Arranged marriages were not just common, they were practically the norm, especially among the upper classes. Your partner wasn't chosen based on attraction or shared interests. Oh, no. Marriages were about securing alliances, preserving family wealth, and maintaining or improving social status. If you were lucky, perhaps you would find love in the process. But more often than not, your feelings were secondary to your family's social and economic needs. Imagine you're a young noblewoman, barely in your teens, and your family has decided that you are to marry the son of another noble house. This wasn't about finding someone you could share late-night talks with over a glass of wine. This was about power. Your dowry would include land, money, and perhaps even soldiers to help ensure your new family's interests. The decision isn't yours. It's a decision made by the heads of your family, who are thinking about political gain, strengthening alliances, and improving their place in society. You were part of a larger, strategic game, and your marriage was your role in the family's long-term plans. Historians still argue about how much agency people had in these arranged marriages. Some believe that, despite the power of parents and societal expectations, medieval people still had some say in their marriage choices. For example, so in some regions, couples could have a marriage by consent, where both parties gave their approval before the union could take place. However, in most cases, particularly among the nobility, the marriage was a decision made by the parents or guardians. It wasn't uncommon for a marriage to be arranged when the couple was still children, with the official wedding taking place years later, when they were old enough to begin fulfilling their marital duties. Even for the common folk, marriage was often an arrangement made by families. Though these unions were generally more about securing labor and land than political alliances. For peasants, marriage wasn't about forming alliances between families. It was about surviving the difficult conditions of medieval life. A marriage meant that you had someone to help run the farm, raise children, and ensure the family's survival through difficult winters. In this context, love and affection were secondary to the need for practical support. And let's not forget that medieval marriage wasn't all about making it official with a ceremony. In many cases, people could live together and have children before a formal wedding ceremony took place. This was especially common among the peasantry, where a simple legal contract could solidify a marriage. The wedding ceremony itself wasn't always a grand affair, especially for the lower classes, and might take place in a small parish church, with only close family and friends attending. But for the wealthy, the ceremony was a significant occasion, complete with elaborate feasts and celebrations. Here's a quirky tidbit. Even after a marriage was arranged, it wasn't always smooth sailing. Medieval marriage contracts often came with stipulations, like the wife's right to separate from her husband if he failed to fulfill his marital duties or if he was found to be cruel or neglectful. So, even in a world where marriages were more about duty than romance, there were still attempts to ensure fairness, or at least some form of protection, within these unions. In the end, arranged marriages were more than just a way of securing a spouse. They were a key part of the social fabric, and their impact rippled through all levels of medieval society. Whether you were a noble with grand alliances to make, or a peasant simply trying to ensure a prosperous future for your family, marriage was about far more than love. It was about building stability, securing resources, and ensuring that your family's legacy would continue. Now, let's get into the role that religion played in medieval courtship and marriage. You might think that in a time when people were so concerned with social alliances and family matters, the church would take a back seat when it came to matters of the heart. But in medieval times, religion had a huge influence on the way people navigated their relationships. The church not only played a role in legitimizing marriages, but it also set strict rules about how courtship and romance should unfold. For most people, the church was the authority when it came to anything related to love and marriage. Courtship often had to be carried out within the framework of Christian teachings, which meant that purity, chastity, and devotion to God were of the utmost importance. Dating, or whatever the medieval equivalent of it was, wasn't just a personal choice, it was a spiritual matter. If you were a young person looking for a partner, your approach had to reflect the morals set out by the church. Physical affection outside of marriage, unthinkable. Premarital sex, a sin. The church's teachings on chastity were clear. Save yourself for marriage, or risk eternal damnation. Romantic gestures, like holding hands or exchanging sweet words, were fine within the context of an approved courtship, but they couldn't go beyond the line of what was considered holy. The church also took a direct role in arranging marriages. In some cases, the local priest or bishop would act as a matchmaker, overseeing the arrangement of the marriage and blessing the union once it had been finalized. In fact, a marriage wasn't considered truly official without the church's blessing. Even if two people had already agreed to marry, the ceremony, performed by a priest, was the legal and spiritual confirmation of the union. This made the church a key player in the formation of relationships, both for the nobility and the peasantry alike. But the church didn't just oversee the act of marriage. It also played a role in defining what was acceptable in the world of courtship. There were strict guidelines about who could marry whom. For instance, it was forbidden for people to marry close relatives, and the church laid out clear rules about acceptable degrees of kinship. Marriages between cousins were often approved, but the church banned unions between closer blood relations, arguing that such marriages violated God's commandments. In medieval society, where family alliances were often made through marriage, these church rules added a layer of complexity to the process. A noble family might want to marry off their daughter to another powerful house, but if they were closely related, they'd have to seek the approval of the church, which could delay or even block the marriage. Historians still debate how much the Church's influence shaped the romantic lives of medieval people. On one hand, religion served as a guiding force, promoting a culture of chastity and devotion within relationships. On the other hand, the strictness of the Church's rules might have led some people to find ways around them. For instance, some medieval lovers secretly eloped or married without a priest's blessing, defying the Church's authority. These clandestine unions, while risky, could be seen as acts of rebellion against the Church's control over personal relationships. A quirky little detail. In some parts of medieval Europe, the Church held betrothal masses, where couples would publicly declare their intention to marry in front of the congregation, essentially making the marriage binding even before the wedding ceremony itself. This was meant to ensure that the couple was committed to each other, but it also showed just how much the Church had a hand in managing relationships, even before they reached the altar. So, while we think of love today as a personal, individual decision in the medieval period, your choice of a partner was often influenced by far more than personal chemistry. The Church, with its focus on chastity, commitment, and legal requirements, had a profound influence on who you married, when you married, and how that relationship was viewed by society. For medieval people, dating wasn't just about fun and games. It was a serious, faith-driven process, and anything beyond that was seen as a potential threat to moral order. Let's take a closer look now at the role of young love in medieval times. You might imagine medieval courtships as stiff, stilted affairs, governed by the rules of family and religion. But there were moments when young love could blossom in the most unexpected of ways. Though courtship was often strictly regulated, there was a certain magic in the idea of young love in medieval society, even if it was sometimes buried beneath the layers of formality and parental approval. So how did young people experience romance in this world? Well, in many ways, it wasn't as freely expressed as we would expect today. Most young people didn't have the luxury of dating as we know it. They couldn't simply meet up for a coffee or go to a movie. The nature of social gatherings, especially for young women, was extremely limited. Women were generally expected to stay within the family home, while young men might have a little more freedom to socialize, especially in public places like the local market or during religious festivals. These gatherings, though, were where most potential courtships began, often initiated by families with the idea of finding suitable spouses for their children. But what about those rare moments when young love truly sparked? When the formalities were pushed aside for a glimmer of affection. In some instances, young men and women might engage in what could only be called courtly love, a concept that was particularly popular in noble circles. Courtly love was a highly stylized form of affection, often built around gestures of admiration rather than physical intimacy. Think of it as a form of romance in which love was seen as a noble pursuit, often focused on idealized, unattainable relationships. A knight would profess his undying affection for a lady, usually someone who was married or otherwise unattainable, and demonstrate his loyalty and devotion through poetry, song, and chivalrous deeds. This idea wasn't grounded in any expectation of physical affection, but it allowed for the notion of romantic yearning to exist in a structured, often unattainable, form. Historians still argue whether courtly love was more than just a literary trope, or whether it reflected real behavior among the upper classes. Some suggest that it was largely symbolic, a way for the noble class to engage in romantic ideals without actually disrupting their social or marital responsibilities. Others point to evidence that the traditions of courtly love influenced real-life relationships, where young knights and ladies expressed their emotions in ways that defied social norms, creating a realm of pure love that was separate from the practical realities of arranged marriages. But what about commoners? For the majority of people, young love had to conform more to the rules of practicality. Romance was still expected to be tempered by family expectations and social norms. However, young people might find moments to express their feelings in more subtle ways, such as through poetry or music, though this was more likely to occur in private or at festivals rather than in everyday life. At these festivals, the atmosphere was more relaxed, and it was easier for young couples to interact without the watchful eyes of parents. Young men and women might sneak a dance or an exchange of glances. And for those brief moments, they could experience a taste of the freedom their parents did not allow. A quirky tidbit. In some cases, young love wasn't just about emotions, it was also about competition. Young people sometimes had to prove their worth to potential suitors, not through wealth or beauty, but through displays of skill or strength. Archery contests, jousting tournaments, or even dance competitions could become the perfect place to court attention, with young suitors competing for the favor of their crush by demonstrating their abilities in a public setting. So, while young love in medieval times wasn't as free-spirited as today's romances, there were still moments where youth and affection managed to break through the constraints of tradition. It wasn't always easy, but there were definitely sparks that could fly amidst the formality of medieval courtship. Now that we've explored young love and how it was shaped by medieval society's rigid social structure, let's take a closer look at how chastity and the pressure of virginity were central to medieval courtship and dating. If you thought modern dating had its pressures, just wait until you hear about the medieval standards. The emphasis on purity and virginity was almost overwhelming, particularly for women, and it was woven deeply into every aspect of medieval relationships and courtship. You could hardly begin a relationship without addressing the notion of chastity. And for young women, this meant that love and sex were often separated by rigid boundaries that were enforced by the church and society. For women in the medieval period, virginity was not just an ideal, it was a requirement. Whether you were from a noble family or from a peasant background, your unmarried virginity was considered one of the most important aspects of your identity. The concept of virginity was tied to purity, innocence, and moral integrity, and it was expected that young women would save themselves for marriage. The pressure to maintain this purity until marriage was immense. And it wasn't just about social expectations. It was about religious and moral duty. The church's teachings reinforced the idea that a woman's worth was heavily tied to her chastity, and losing one's virginity before marriage could result in social ostracism and, for many, a stain on their reputation that could last for life. Historians still argue whether these pressures were universally felt by all medieval women, or whether they were more pronounced in certain classes or regions. Some suggest that the ideals surrounding virginity were most heavily enforced among the nobility, who had the most to lose in terms of political and familial alliances. Others believe that these ideals permeated all levels of society, even among commoners, where the concept of virginity was still crucial for maintaining one's moral standing in a tightly knit community. In addition to the religious and social pressures, medieval marriage contracts often came with strict clauses related to virginity. The bride's family would promise a virgin bride to the groom, and if this wasn't the case on the wedding night, the marriage could be annulled. This added a layer of stress and anxiety for the young woman, who was expected not only to marry well, but also to uphold the promise of chastity. Imagine the weight of knowing that your first night of marriage intended to be a celebration of love and union, could turn into an ordeal under the public scrutiny of your family and new in-laws. The pressure didn't end with women, though. Men, too, were expected to maintain a certain level of purity, though their sexual conduct was often less scrutinized. For men, the focus was more on the act of marriage itself, ensuring that it was legally and socially valid, rather than maintaining virginity. However, it was still important for them to present themselves as honorable suitors who could provide for their wives and families. These societal expectations weren't just about physical purity. They were about character, morality, and the reputation of the entire family. A quirky detail here is that in certain parts of medieval Europe, there were literal purity tests that could take place after the wedding. The newlywed couple's marriage bed was sometimes examined to ensure that the bride was indeed a virgin. If the marriage bed was found wanting, the marriage could be annulled, and the woman could be sent back to her family in shame. This harsh reality underscores just how intensely virginity was valued and how much pressure women were under to adhere to these societal norms. This cultural obsession with virginity and chastity wasn't just about controlling women. It was about control over social relationships. Marriage and dating were not only about personal desire or affection, they were about preserving the social order, family ties, and, above all, moral and religious ideals. Let's move on to some of the quirky and often peculiar medieval dating rituals and customs that made courtship such a public, community-oriented affair. If you think dating today can be a little strange, wait until you hear about the medieval version. From the exchange of symbolic tokens to some rather out-of-the-box romantic gestures. The medieval approach to courtship was full of traditions that may seem unusual to us now, but were taken very seriously back in the day. One of the most interesting customs was the exchange of gifts. And not just any kind of gift, but highly symbolic ones. Imagine a young man courting a young woman and presenting her with a token of his affection, perhaps a small handcrafted item like a glove, a ribbon, or a piece of jewelry. These weren't just random gifts. They were symbols of his intentions and affection. A ribbon could symbolize a promise of fidelity, while a glove could represent a desire to court. The giving of these tokens was a way for the suitor to demonstrate his seriousness in pursuing the woman, signaling that he was willing to prove his commitment. Historians still debate whether these gifts had deeper meanings or if they were simply practical gestures. Some argue that these tokens were used to publicly declare the suitor's intentions, while others believe they were more like modern-day engagement rings, meant to symbolize a commitment to marriage without necessarily involving formal agreements. Regardless of their exact significance, these gifts were a key part of medieval courtship and often used as a form of communication between the couple, as well as a way to display their commitment to one another. And if you were a noble, these tokens could be quite elaborate. Embroidered handkerchiefs, fine rings, or even expensive trinkets that represented not just personal affection, but also social status. Then, there were the rather unusual medieval courtship games. Like the Trial of Chastity, this might sound a little odd. But some young women were encouraged to participate in what amounted to a game or test of their worthiness to be courted. A man might offer a lady a small gift or token, and the lady's response, whether she accepted or declined it, would be seen as a sign of her availability or interest. If she accepted, it signaled her willingness to enter into a courtship. If she refused, it was a polite rejection, and the courtship would be considered over. These gestures, though seemingly small, were ways to communicate one's readiness for romance without saying much at all. In this context, courtship wasn't just a personal affair. It was often a public declaration of your intentions to the community. One of the more peculiar customs involved the use of courtly love rituals, especially among the nobility. Courtly love, though largely an idealized literary tradition, had real-world applications in the medieval dating scene. A knight might swear his allegiance to a lady, vowing to serve her in a manner that bordered on devotion. This could involve writing her poetry, performing feats of bravery, or completing tasks in her honor. While these acts of courtly love were symbolic and often unrequited, they were part of a larger cultural framework in which love was seen as a noble pursuit. This form of romance didn't always lead to marriage, but instead created a space for idealized, often unattainable affection that still shaped the way medieval people thought about courtship. A quirky tidbit. A popular courtship ritual involved love tokens or love notes, where a suitor would send his affections in the form of a letter or verse. These letters were not only a means of expressing love, but they also served as a form of social communication. The letters would often be read aloud to the woman's family, and their reactions could be as important as the message itself. The social pressure to perform these rituals in front of an audience was part of the reason why courtship was such a public affair. If the letter was well received, it might lead to further courtship opportunities. If it was rejected, well, it was back to the drawing board. The beauty of these rituals lies in their formality and symbolism. Unlike modern-day dating, where the exchange of text messages might suffice as a sign of interest, medieval courtship was about publicly displaying your feelings and intentions. These rituals created clear rules of engagement, without the need for a swipe right or awkward first dates. If a suitor didn't know the correct etiquette or failed to perform these actions properly, it could end the courtship before it even began. In the end, medieval courtship wasn't just about two people getting to know each other. It was about navigating a complex world of social expectations, familial duties, and public rituals. The stakes were high, and the pressure to perform within this framework made the entire experience feel like a grand social dance, where every move, glance, and gesture mattered. Let's now take a look at how the aristocracy, with all its wealth and power, navigated the dating and courtship scene, while peasants were busy securing practical marriages based on necessity. The wealthy were able to approach romance with a bit more flair. But, of course, this came with its own set of rules and pressures. Dating for the noble class wasn't about spontaneous connections or casual meetings. It was a highly strategic affair, and romance was something to be carefully managed, just like any other asset. For the aristocracy, the purpose of courtship wasn't just about finding love or companionship. It was about creating and maintaining powerful alliances. If you were a noble, your marriage was often part of a larger game of diplomacy, one where every match had the potential to increase your family's power, land, or wealth. As you can imagine, these types of courtships were carefully orchestrated, and the suitors were expected to demonstrate their worthiness in a variety of ways. A noblewoman might be expected to choose a partner who could offer not just emotional compatibility, but also the promise of political or financial gain. This world of noble courtship came with its own set of expectations, including elaborate displays of chivalry. In this social class, courtship rituals were performed as public spectacles of devotion, often involving gestures like grand feasts, tournaments, and even poetry. The concept of courtly love, where knights expressed their admiration for noble women through acts of valor and devotion, was a key part of these relationships. A knight might participate in a jousting tournament or risk his life in battle in the name of his lady's honor. But all of this wasn't just for her benefit. It was a display for the public eye, showing that the suitor was worthy of her hand. Historians still debate whether the romantic ideal of courtly love ever truly existed outside of literature. Some argue that courtly love was primarily an artistic concept invented by poets and storytellers, while others suggest that it played a more substantial role in real-life relationships, especially among the nobility, where the ideals of chivalry and devotion were considered part of one's social duty. Either way, the effect of these ideals on the way nobles courted was profound. The rituals, performances, and public displays of affection were more about demonstrating social status than about fostering personal connection. A quirky tidbit about this period: courtly love often had a very specific, almost ritualistic quality to it. A knight, for example, might be expected to serve his lady with a formality and devotion that bordered on the absurd. He would vow to honor her above all others, sometimes even swearing that he would put her needs above his own. But the nature of these vows wasn't always about emotional intimacy. In many cases, these expressions of devotion were about social propriety, maintaining the knight's image and ensuring that the lady's status was upheld. For the wealthy, love and courtship weren't just personal. They were about preserving one's family's reputation. A noble family was a business, and just like any other business, it had to carefully manage its public image and alliances. That meant that if you were a young noblewoman, your choice of a husband was expected to enhance your family's standing in society, whether through wealth, land, or military power. And while you might experience affection for your suitor, you also had to consider how he fit into the grand scheme of your family's future. It wasn't unusual for young lovers to be kept apart by their families or to be forced into arranged marriages for political reasons, even if there was a strong emotional connection between them. At the same time, the wealthy could afford a level of privacy in their courtships that others could not. Noble couples often had more freedom to interact in private, where they could enjoy the types of personal, emotional connections that the common folk could only dream of. They could take walks in the gardens, write each other love letters, and even exchange intimate gifts without the constant scrutiny of family members. For the upper class, courtship could be a performance for public consumption, but it also allowed for moments of personal affection, as long as they didn't jeopardize the political agenda behind the marriage. Now, let's talk about the role of romantic gestures in medieval dating and how these acts of devotion were more than just sweet, tender moments between couples. In the medieval world, romantic gestures were highly ritualized, and every action, from a simple glance to an elaborate poem, carried a weight of meaning. While today, we might give a partner a bouquet of flowers or write them a love letter, in medieval times, these gestures were not just acts of affection. They were part of a larger game of courtship, often governed by societal norms, chivalric codes, and the expectations of the wider community. One of the most iconic and often misunderstood romantic gestures was the act of courtly love, which involved a series of formal, almost theatrical, displays of affection. Imagine a knight on horseback, dedicating his every victory and heroic deed to his lady love. This wasn't about hoping for a kiss at the end of the day. This was a public declaration of devotion, a performance of social norms that demonstrated the knight's commitment to a lady who was often distant, unreachable, and sometimes even married to someone else. This ideal of courtly love was about demonstrating honor, virtue, and dedication, all within a public context, where romantic gestures were viewed as expressions of one's social and moral character. While courtly love might sound like something straight out of a romance novel, it had a strong impact on medieval courtship. Knights weren't just fighting battles for their lady's honor for fun. Their actions were meant to publicly validate their worthiness, not just for the lady, but for the society that was watching. Their deeds were performed in front of an audience, whether at a jousting tournament or during a royal feast. A knight might give his lady a piece of his armor as a token of affection, or he might send her a finely crafted gift, such as a jeweled ring or a beautiful piece of cloth, as an expression of his devotion. These tokens were not just gifts. They were meant to symbolize his devotion and to demonstrate his status and honor in the eyes of others. Historians still argue whether the ideal of courtly love reflected real-world relationships or whether it was simply a literary concept created by poets. Some argue that it was more of an idealistic fantasy, promoted by the courts of the nobility, while others believe that these customs influenced real-world behavior, especially among the upper classes. Regardless, the rituals of courtly love had a profound impact on medieval dating, particularly for the aristocracy, where public gestures of devotion were used to solidify relationships and demonstrate social status. A quirky detail about medieval romantic gestures involves something called love tokens. These were small, symbolic gifts exchanged between lovers, and they ranged from jewelry to personal items like handkerchiefs or gloves. These tokens were often engraved with personal messages or symbols that signified the bond between the giver and the recipient. The exchange of these tokens wasn't just a way to express affection. It was also a way of marking the relationship in a public, tangible way. It was almost like an early form of commitment rings, but with more creative and personalized flair. However, not all romantic gestures were about grand displays of affection. For the more humble commoners, the act of courting might involve simple gifts, like a handmade piece of cloth or a bouquet of wildflowers. While these gestures didn't carry the same weight of public ceremony as the nobles' courtly love practices, they were no less meaningful. For common folk, courtship was still a public affair, and gestures of affection were often viewed as declarations of seriousness in one's intent to marry. And while flowers might seem a little cliché by today's standards, in the medieval world, they held particular significance, often symbolizing love, purity, and devotion. A single rose or a cluster of daisies could convey messages of affection that, in a time when words were often restrained by social rules, spoke volumes. Ultimately, romantic gestures in medieval times were more than just acts of affection. They were part of the complex and highly structured system of courtship, social standing, and personal identity. Whether it was a knight's heroic deeds or a simple bouquet of flowers, every gesture carried weight, and every act of devotion was a public statement, not just of love, but of one's place in society. Now, let's talk about how medieval festivals became the perfect opportunity for matchmaking and romance. These festivals, often held to celebrate religious holidays, harvests, or seasonal changes, weren't just about feasts, games, and dancing. They were also opportunities for young people to meet, court, and even marry. Medieval festivals were a hub of social interaction, where people from various classes and backgrounds could gather, flirt, and, if the stars aligned, form a romantic connection. While the everyday structure of medieval society was often rigid, festivals provided the kind of freedom that allowed young people to step out of their family roles and explore the possibility of love. Picture yourself at one of these festivals. The air is filled with the sounds of music, the scents of roasted meats, and the laughter of people dancing around large bonfires. Men and women are dressed in their best clothes, with the sense of occasion hanging in the air. For young people, this was a chance to step away from the watchful eyes of parents and guardians and engage in a little light-hearted flirtation. It wasn't uncommon for young men and women to pair off during dances or participate in games where they would end up paired with a potential suitor. It was at these festivals that courtship could unfold in a much less formal, more spontaneous way than the typical family-approved arrangements. For the wealthy, festivals were an important venue for networking and solidifying alliances. But for the common folk, these gatherings were about much more than just business. They were a break from the monotony of work and a chance to connect with potential partners. Imagine the joy of participating in a dance, the opportunity to chat under the stars, or even the thrill of sharing a piece of freshly baked bread with someone who caught your eye. These moments weren't about long walks in the moonlight, though they did happen. They were about seizing an opportunity for connection within the framework of social norms and expectations. Historians still argue about how much agency young people really had at these festivals. Were they truly free to choose their partners, or were these interactions still shaped by the constraints of their families and social status? Some believe that festivals offered a brief respite from the social pressures of medieval life, where young people could find companionship based on personal attraction. However, others suggest that even at these festivals, the overarching system of family obligations and societal expectations remained in place, and any pairing or courtship that took place was still influenced by the need to make alliances and secure advantageous marriages. A quirky detail here: medieval festivals often had some very peculiar customs designed to bring people together. One common event was the choosing of the May Queen, or Queen of the Festival, where young women were nominated for their beauty, grace, and social standing, and the festival's celebrants would pick their queen. This wasn't just an honor. It was also a chance for men to show their affection, and for women to flaunt their desirability. The woman selected as the May Queen was often surrounded by admirers, and it wasn't unusual for this role to lead to matchmaking and romance. Her crowning, often in a public ceremony, was an event that made her the center of attention for the entire festival, creating the perfect stage for courting. Another quirky tradition, particularly popular in medieval Europe, was the Tourney of Love. This was a jousting tournament with a twist. Knights would compete for the favor of a lady, and the winner would gain the right to present her with a token of his victory, a display of honor and affection. While jousting was already a common medieval sport, the added romantic element turned the tournament into a social event that brought together potential suitors and their families. Winning a lady's favor through a joust wasn't just about physical skill. It was also about demonstrating your worthiness as a partner. These festivals weren't just occasions to meet new people. They were opportunities to publicly express romantic interest, engage in flirtation, and sometimes even form lasting relationships. But as much as festivals allowed for spontaneity, they were still embedded in a social system that linked courtship to familial and social obligations. No matter how many romantic gestures were exchanged, those connections were often examined through the lens of family politics, wealth, and status. Let's dive into the romantic ideal that defined much of medieval courtship: chivalry and knights. The concept of chivalry, which was tied to the ideals of knightly conduct, honor, and loyalty, played a significant role in the way courtship was performed, especially among the upper classes. Chivalry wasn't just a set of rules for battle. It was a code that governed how knights should behave in all aspects of life, including relationships and courtship. And at the heart of this chivalric code was the idea of courtly love. Courtly love. While it might sound like a simple, romantic notion, was actually a highly stylized and ritualized form of affection that involved a knight performing heroic deeds for a lady who was often distant, married, or otherwise unattainable. This wasn't your modern idea of love, where two people find each other and fall in love based on mutual attraction and compatibility. Instead, courtly love was about a knight's idealized devotion to his lady, often expressed through poetry, songs, and grand gestures. His loyalty to her was absolute, and his actions were driven by the desire to serve and honor her from a distance. Imagine a knight, dressed in shining armor, dedicating his victories in battle to a lady he may never even speak to. His love for her was often unspoken, and any romantic physical gestures were largely absent from the equation. Courtly love was about emotional devotion and the desire to prove oneself worthy, not about consummating the relationship. The lady, in turn, was expected to be noble, virtuous, and sometimes unattainable. This idealized notion of love created a framework for romantic behavior that, for many, was more about demonstrating one's worth through deeds than expressing mutual affection. Historians still debate how closely the ideal of courtly love reflected actual relationships in medieval times. Some argue that courtly love was largely a literary and artistic creation, invented by poets and troubadours to represent an unattainable ideal. Others suggest that it influenced real-world relationships, particularly among the aristocracy, where knights and ladies did indeed engage in highly ritualized forms of courtship. Regardless of how deeply it influenced actual romantic practices, the concept of courtly love played a key role in shaping how knights, nobles, and those around them viewed love and relationships. A quirky detail here. The knight's devotion to courtly love wasn't just a private affair. Often, his lady would bestow him with a token of favor, like a scarf or a piece of cloth, that he would wear during tournaments or in battle as a sign of his loyalty and devotion. This act wasn't just about personal affection. It was a public display of devotion that could elevate both the knight and the lady in the eyes of others. The knight's actions, whether it was performing feats of bravery or composing songs of praise, were all part of the public performance of love, elevating the lady in the eyes of the community. Despite the focus on distant admiration, courtly love did sometimes lead to more tangible relationships. When a knight's devotion was reciprocated, it could spark the beginnings of a marriage or an alliance, though the process was often slow and laden with the expectations of both families. Yet, even for the wealthy and noble, the pursuit of courtly love wasn't always about casual flirting. It was about proving one's worthiness, not just to the lady in question, but to society as a whole. For the common folk, courtly love was more of an abstract idea than a reality. Still, chivalric notions of loyalty, honor, and respect found their way into the relationships of peasants and townspeople, who may not have had jousting tournaments to attend, but still valued honor and respect in their courtships. Though the formalized structures of chivalry were more common in the upper classes, the values they promoted still affected the broader culture. So, while chivalry and courtly love may seem outdated or distant from the way we date today, these medieval ideals created a lasting framework for how people viewed love, relationships, and devotion. Love in the medieval world wasn't about easy access or instant gratification. It was about proving worth, demonstrating loyalty, and elevating the lady or gentleman in question to an almost mythical status. It wasn't about swiping right or sending a quick text. It was about crafting an idealized, distant love that required patience, devotion, and, above all, respect. Now, let's talk about the more forbidden side of medieval romance. The idea of love that defied the social norms and boundaries of the time, as structured and formal as courtship was. There were still moments when individuals found ways to break the rules. The idea of forbidden love, especially in terms of social class or family expectations, was very real in medieval times. When it came to dating, there were certain unspoken boundaries. Knights were expected to marry women of noble birth. Merchants typically married within their class, and peasants didn't have the luxury of romantic escapades outside their immediate social circle. But, of course, in every age, there were those willing to defy expectations. Let's imagine a young noblewoman who falls for a low-born man. He's not wealthy. He doesn't have lands or titles to offer. But she finds herself captivated by his wit, his charm, and his courage. The idea of crossing class lines in medieval society was fraught with peril. A noblewoman was expected to marry a man who could strengthen her family's position, someone who brought political or economic advantages. To choose someone from outside the social class could mean scandal and, for the woman, the loss of her status and her family's approval. And yet, this didn't stop some from following their hearts. Forbidden love, in medieval times, didn't just happen between different social classes. It could also occur between individuals whose families were sworn enemies or had long-standing grudges. In the world of knights and lords, honor and alliances meant everything. To marry someone from an enemy family was a bold act of rebellion, and in some cases, such marriages were seen as both a betrayal and an act of defiance. The story of Romeo and Juliet might feel like something created purely for literary drama. But in medieval Europe, similar tensions were very much a reality. Families would sometimes keep their children from marrying potential suitors if they didn't meet the political or social expectations, which led to secret courtships and elopements. These were dangerous romances, highly risky, with the potential for severe consequences. Historians still debate how widespread this kind of forbidden love was in medieval society. Some argue that most medieval relationships, especially among the lower classes, were much more practical and less influenced by romantic notions of love. However, there are enough records of forbidden relationships, like clandestine marriages, elopements, and secret liaisons, to suggest that even in a time governed by rules, there were those who were willing to defy convention for the sake of love. For the wealthy, this often meant secret marriages or affairs that could risk not only social standing, but also family alliances. In some cases, couples would marry in secret, defying their family's wishes, and hope that their families would eventually come to accept the relationship. The difficulty here wasn't just personal, it was political. The wrong marriage could lead to disinheritance, broken alliances, or even public disgrace. Still, some couples found ways to secretly marry, escaping their family's scrutiny. For the lower classes, forbidden love had a different kind of tension. A peasant might fall in love with someone of a higher rank, only to face barriers that prevented them from marrying. These kinds of relationships were far less common, as the realities of class and wealth differences created strong social barriers, but it wasn't impossible. Commoners sometimes crossed class lines when they could make it work. These unions, however, were usually informal and not recognized by the church or society. A poor couple could form a lifelong bond, but without the proper blessings of their families and the church, they might be seen as living in sin or outside of societal norms. A quirky detail. In some cases, medieval lovers who were kept apart by family and social expectations found creative ways to express their love. They might exchange love tokens, pieces of jewelry, embroidered handkerchiefs, or even poems, as symbols of their devotion. These tokens were often small and personal, but they carried a weight of meaning, especially for those whose love was kept in secret. Forbidden love in medieval times wasn't always about grand gestures or tragic endings. It was about challenging the very structures of society that dictated who could marry whom. For some, these relationships were a quiet form of rebellion, a rejection of the rules that sought to define who they could love and marry. Though they weren't as common as the more traditional marriages, they represented a powerful longing for freedom and a desire for love that couldn't be constrained by the rigid norms of the time. Now that we've touched on the sometimes secretive, rebellious side of medieval love, let's explore what happened when things didn't quite go as planned. Romance, like today, didn't always follow the neat, idealized course that we hope for. Medieval dating wasn't all poetry, chivalric gestures, and fairy tale endings. Sometimes, it all went wrong. Relationships broke down, affairs were uncovered, and failed courtships caused public scandal. But what happened when the love wasn't returned, or when marriages didn't work out as expected? Let's look at how medieval society dealt with the breakdowns in romantic relationships and the consequences for those involved. Imagine you're a young woman, having been married off in an arranged marriage, and it turns out your husband isn't quite what you expected. Perhaps he's cruel, inattentive, or worse, completely indifferent to you. Medieval marriages weren't just about compatibility. They were about fulfilling obligations. But when the expectations of those obligations weren't met, it could lead to serious issues, both for the couple and for the broader family. And no, divorce wasn't exactly an option. The church didn't approve of divorce. It was seen as a breaking of the sacred bond between man and woman. The idea of simply walking away from a marriage wasn't possible for most people. However, there were alternatives, though they weren't easy to come by. For the wealthy, the process of annulment was the closest thing to a divorce. Annulments, however, weren't granted lightly. The marriage had to be proven invalid for one reason or another, whether it was due to lack of consent, impotence, or certain types of deception. If a marriage was annulled, it essentially erased the marriage as though it had never happened. It wasn't exactly a simple process, and it wasn't something that the common folk could easily access. In some cases, an annulment was sought after one partner discovered that the other was unable to consummate the marriage. But this could only be proven through physical inspection, awkward to say the least. Historians still debate how often annulments were granted in medieval times. Some suggest they were a relatively rare occurrence, while others believe that wealthy families sometimes used the church's power to dissolve marriages when the union wasn't beneficial. The process of annulment wasn't just about personal discontent. It had serious social and political consequences. For example, if a marriage was annulled, the political and economic alliances it created could be severed, which was not something that any noble family would take lightly. It was the kind of decision that could impact generations of family legacy. For the common people, the breakdown of a marriage often didn't come with the option of annulment. Instead, couples who couldn't live together could opt for separation, though it was usually temporary. In many rural areas, the local clergy or elders might step in to mediate disputes, and physical separation could occur for a period, with the hope that the couple would work through their differences. In some cases, marriages were dissolved when one partner left for a new life. But this often came with social stigma attached. A woman whose husband abandoned her was often left without the protection of marriage, making her vulnerable to social judgment and even poverty. What about affairs? The medieval world had very strict rules when it came to infidelity, especially for women. A woman found to be unfaithful could be publicly shamed, punished, or even divorced, depending on her social standing. For men, however, infidelity was more socially acceptable, at least for the nobility. They were expected to have affairs, as long as they didn't jeopardize the political marriage or upset the status quo. A nobleman's affair wouldn't typically destroy his marriage, though it might cause a rift with his wife or family. For peasants, however, infidelity was more of a social taboo, though it wasn't uncommon for lovers to quietly engage in extramarital affairs, especially in rural communities where marriage bonds were less strictly monitored. The consequences of failed courtships were also felt in the realm of arranged marriages. If a courtship was broken off before marriage, especially when public commitment had been made, it could lead to scandal. Sometimes these broken engagements were resolved quietly, but in some cases, they turned into public dramas. If a marriage contract was broken without a valid reason, it could lead to disputes over dowries, with legal battles ensuing over money or property that had been promised but not delivered. A quirky tidbit. In some cases, the breakup of a relationship could lead to public declarations of rejection. Lovers who had once exchanged love tokens or vows would sometimes engage in a very public breakup ceremony, returning tokens or severing their relationship in a very formalized way. This was particularly true among the nobility, where the public nature of such gestures mattered. It was almost like a medieval version of a social media breakup, but done in person for all to witness. In the end, failed relationships, whether through annulments, infidelity, or broken engagements, were not just personal matters. They were societal events with far-reaching consequences. The breakdown of a marriage or a courtship was a disruption to the carefully constructed social order, and those involved often faced more than just emotional turmoil. They faced social rejection, financial hardship, and, at times, legal ramifications. As we near the end of our exploration of medieval romance and courtship, let's take a step back and reflect on how the medieval approach to dating and relationships still influences the way we think about love today. While the social structures and norms that defined courtship in medieval times have long since faded, many of the ideals and traditions that were established back then continue to shape our modern understanding of relationships, even if we don't realize it. From the rituals of courtly love to the importance of family approval in marriage, the medieval world set a framework for dating that, though transformed, still has echoes in the way we approach romance. One of the most lasting legacies of medieval courtship is the idea of romantic gestures. We may not be sending our knights into battle for a lady's honor, but we still love grand, sweeping displays of affection. Whether it's the tradition of gifting flowers or going all out for a date night, there's something about the drama of love that continues to captivate us, just as it did for the nobility of medieval courts. Even today, The idea of devotion and loyalty in love is often expressed through symbolic gestures, from proposing with a ring to writing heartfelt letters. Another lasting influence is the concept of chivalry, which has evolved into our modern-day notions of politeness, respect, and admiration in relationships. While knights and ladies may no longer play out their roles in real life, the underlying values of respect, service, and honor are still present in the way we are expected to treat our partners. The knight's vow to defend his lady's honor might seem outdated, but the desire to make one's partner feel valued and respected remains a cornerstone of modern romantic relationships. The role of family in marriage is also something that hasn't disappeared completely. While today's couples have much more freedom in choosing their partners, the idea of family approval and the pressure of social expectations are still present in many cultures. Whether it's the unspoken expectations of parents or the influence of community and friends, the influence of those around us can still play a role in who we end up with. While the stakes may not be as high as they were in medieval times, the importance of family dynamics in relationships remains significant. And then, of course, there's the role of forbidden love. As much as we may think of medieval romances as being constrained by the rigid structures of society, many of them were about breaking free from those constraints. Whether it was a love affair across social classes or a relationship that defied family expectations, the medieval world was full of stories of people pushing the boundaries of what was allowed. These forbidden loves weren't always accepted, and they often came with consequences, but they remind us that love doesn't always follow the rules and can sometimes thrive in the spaces between what society deems acceptable. In a way, the modern notion of forbidden love is still alive and well. Whether it's the thrill of a secret romance or the desire to be with someone who's different from the norm. The legacy of medieval romance also shows up in the way we think about marriage. While arranged marriages are largely a thing of the past, the idea of marriage as a social contract, built on mutual respect, loyalty, and shared responsibilities, is still central to many relationships today. For medieval couples, marriage wasn't just about love. It was about family, property, and alliances. While those external factors are less important now, the institution of marriage still carries a sense of formality and social importance, and the idea of making a lifelong commitment remains a powerful force. As we wrap up our journey through medieval courtship, it's clear that while the customs and practices of the time were vastly different from our own, the human experiences of love, desire, and connection haven't changed all that much. The rules may be different, the expectations may have evolved, but the fundamental desires we have to love and be loved remain the same. So, the next time you're swiping through dating apps or crafting a thoughtful romantic gesture, take a moment to appreciate the long history of love, from chivalric knights to modern-day romantics. And who knows, maybe we're all still just searching for that elusive form of courtly love after all these years.